Welcome to All Night Society. Listen carefully, because these stories actually happened.
The intake officer at Bayside State Prison told me to keep my eyes on the floor and my mouth shut. I was in for a non-violent fraud charge, a stupid mistake that landed me in a cell with a man people called the Broker. His real name was Arthur. He was 70 years old and looked like a retired librarian. He was serving 3 life sentences for a series of murders in the late 90s. The cell was cramped and smelled like floor wax and old sweat. Arthur sat on the bottom bunk and spent most of the day folding pieces of paper into tiny cranes. He was polite. He asked me if I liked to read. He offered me half of his bread during dinner. It was a strange, peaceful routine that made me think the stories about him were just prison myths. By the end of the first week, I felt safe. Arthur was a quiet old man who snored softly and liked to talk about history. He told me he was innocent, of course. Everyone in Bayside said that. But Arthur said it with a kind of sad smile that made me believe him. He told me the police needed a scapegoat and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He became like a mentor to me. He taught me how to keep my bunk tight and how to avoid the troublemakers in the yard. I started to feel lucky to have him as a cellmate. The other inmates avoided our cell like it was haunted, which gave us a lot of privacy. I thought they were just scared of his reputation. One night, a guard I hadn't seen before came to our bars. He didn't do a head count. He just stood there and stared at us. He looked terrified. He whispered something to Arthur that I couldn't hear. Arthur nodded and went back to his paper folding. After the guard left, I asked Arthur what that was about. Arthur didn't look up. He told me that the guard was just new and nervous. I sat back on my bunk, but something felt off. The air in the cell felt cold. I looked over at the pile of paper cranes Arthur had made. There must have been hundreds of them. I picked one up while Arthur wasn't looking. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a blank piece of paper. It was a page from a court transcript. I read the lines quickly. It described the evidence found in a killer's basement. It mentioned a specific detail that had never been released to the public. The killer had a signature. He would leave a hand-folded paper crane inside the throat of every victim. My hands started to shake. I looked at the bottom of the page. The name of the lead investigator was my father's name. I remembered my father talking about this case when I was a kid. He was the one who caught the Broker. I looked at Arthur, and for the first time, he wasn't smiling. He was watching me with intense, predatory focus. He leaned forward and told me that he had been waiting 20 years for a member of my family to be sent to this specific block. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh piece of paper. He told me he already knew exactly how many folds it would take to finish his next piece.
Before we continue, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to like and subscribe. It really motivates me to keep going.
I've spent 3 months staring at the photo I took of Julian right before he walked behind that boulder. It was day 4 on the Appalachian Trail near the Georgia border. We were moving steady, about 15 miles a day. The routine was the only thing that mattered. Wake up at 5, boil water, pack the tent, walk until the sun started to dip. It was a rhythm that made the world feel small and manageable. We were talking about what we wanted to eat when we got back to civilization. Julian wanted a double cheeseburger with extra pickles. I remember him laughing about it. He stepped around a large gray rock on a narrow part of the path. I was maybe 10 feet behind him. I looked down to adjust my trekking pole for a second. When I looked up, the trail ahead was empty. The silence hit me first. Usually you can hear a hiker's boots on the dirt or the rustle of their synthetic jacket. There was nothing, just the wind in the pines and a single hawk circling overhead. I walked past the boulder expecting to see him waiting for me. There was only a straight stretch of trail lined with dense laurel thickets. Julian wasn't there. I called his name, my voice sounding thin and weak in the open air. I checked the thickets, thinking he might have stepped off to use the bathroom. The branches were thick and unbroken. There were no fresh footprints in the soft mud off the path. I stood there for 10 minutes, just listening. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited for a sound that never came. I set up camp right there on the trail. I didn't sleep. I kept my headlamp on the highest setting and swept the beam across the trees every few minutes. About 3 in the morning, I heard a voice. It sounded like Julian. He was whispering my name from somewhere deep in the woods. I started to unzip my tent, but I stopped. The voice was coming from the top of an oak tree. Julian was 6 feet tall and had a bad knee. He couldn't climb a tree in the dark without making a sound. The whispering didn't stop. It just got faster, repeating my name over and over like a broken record. I sat in my sleeping bag with my knife in my hand until the sun came up. When the search party arrived 2 days later, they found my gear, but they also found something else. About 50 yards from where Julian disappeared, they found a backpack. It was an old canvas rucksack from the 1970s. Inside was a camera with a roll of film that hadn't been developed. I stayed in a motel in town while the police did their work. A week later, a detective came to see me. He looked like he hadn't slept in a month. He laid a photo on the table. It was a grainy black and white shot of a campsite. In the corner of the frame, there was a man sitting on a log. He was wearing the exact same bright orange jacket Julian had bought for our trip. He was holding the same water bottle with the same scratched sticker on the side. The photo was dated 40 years before Julian was even born. I went back to the trail one last time to leave a memorial. As I was walking back, the smell of old bleach and copper hit me the second I pushed open the front door of my childhood home. I hadn't been back to 42, Briar Lane, in 20 years. The real estate agent gave me the keys and refused to step inside. I walked into the living room and saw the dark stains on the floorboards. The news reports said there had been a struggle, but no bodies were ever found. My parents simply vanished one Tuesday afternoon while I was at school. The house was exactly how it was left. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the coffee table. My mother's reading glasses were still perched on the arm of the sofa. It felt like the house was holding its breath. I went to the kitchen and saw that the table was set for 3 people. There was a bowl of rotted fruit in the center. The wallpaper was peeling in long, jagged strips that looked like skin. I heard a heavy dragging sound coming from the floor above me. It was slow and deliberate. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have turned around and driven back to the city, but I needed to know what happened to them. I walked up the stairs, my boots echoing on the wood. The air grew colder with every step. I reached the landing and saw that my bedroom door was wide open. Inside, my old bed was neatly made. On top of the pillow sat a small, wooden music box. It was a gift I had lost months before the disappearance. I reached out to touch it, but I stopped when I noticed the floor. The floorboards in my room had been sanded down recently. They were light and clean compared to the rest of the house. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the wood. I could hear a faint scratching. It didn't sound like rats. It sounded like fingernails against stone. I stood up and pulled back the rug. There was a trap door I had never seen as a child. I pulled the handle, and the door swung open. A ladder led down into a dark crawl space that shouldn't have existed. I climbed down, my flashlight cutting through the thick dust. At the bottom, I found a small room lined with concrete. There were 2 sleeping bags on the floor. There were stacks of canned food and dozens of empty water bottles. Then I saw the wall. It was covered in hundreds of Polaroid photos. Every single one of them was of me. They showed me at the grocery store, at my office, and sleeping in my apartment 500 miles away. The photos started from the day my parents went missing and continued until yesterday. I realized then that my parents hadn't been kidnapped. They had been hiding here. They had been watching me their entire lives. The scratching sound returned, but it wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from the ladder behind me. I turned my light toward the opening and saw a hand reaching down. It was gaunt and pale, with a wedding ring I recognized. I didn't wait for them to come down. I pushed past the hand and scrambled up the ladder. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove to the local police station and demanded they search the house. The police came back an hour later with a look of confusion on their faces. They told me the house was empty. They said there was no trapdoor in the bedroom. They said the floorboards were original and untouched. I showed them the key the real estate agent had given me. The officer frowned and checked his notes. He told me that real estate company went out of business 10 years ago. I looked down at my hand and realized I was still holding the music box. I opened the lid. It didn't play a song. It played a recorded loop of my mother's voice. She was whispering my name over and over again. I looked in the rearview mirror as I drove away. Two figures were standing in the upstairs window of the house. They weren't waving. They were just watching. I checked my phone and saw a new message from an unknown number. It was a photo of me sitting in my car, taken from the woods across the street. The elevator in the medical arts building was old and coated in brushed steel that showed every fingerprint. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. A man in a gray suit caught the door at the last second. He didn't say thank you. He just stood in the corner and stared at the floor. He was carrying a leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to be filled with bricks. We passed the 8th floor when the lights flickered and the car came to a violent halt. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a sickly red glow. I pressed the call button, but only static came through the speaker. "It's okay," the man said. His voice was surprisingly calm. "They know we're here. Let's just sit and wait." He seemed so relaxed that I felt my own panic subside. We sat down on the floor on opposite sides of the car. He introduced himself as Victor. He told me he was an architect. "I actually helped design the renovation for this wing," Victor said. He smiled, and for a moment, I felt like I was in safe hands. He started talking about the structural integrity of the cables. We talked for 20 minutes. He told me about his kids and his dog. I told him about my job in the lab upstairs. It felt like a normal conversation between two strangers waiting for help. I leaned my head against the wall and closed my eyes. "I'm just glad I'm not in here alone," I said. "Me too, Naomi," he replied. I opened my eyes. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told him my name. I looked at the front of my scrub top. My ID badge was flipped over. There was no way he could have seen it. "How do you know my name?" I asked. My voice sounded thin in the small space. Victor didn't skip a beat. "You mentioned it earlier," he said. His smile didn't change, but his eyes seemed to go flat. I knew for a fact I hadn't. I am very private about my personal life. I looked at his briefcase. The latch was slightly open. Inside, I could see a stack of papers with the letterhead of the lab where I work. I realized the elevator hadn't stopped because of a mechanical failure. Victor had reached out and hit the stop switch so quickly I hadn't even noticed. He wasn't an architect. "You're the one who filed the report about the missing vials, aren't you?" Victor asked. He wasn't smiling anymore. He stood up slowly, looming over me in the red light. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like jelly. I realized that the calm conversation, the stories about his family, it was all a tactic to keep me from screaming while the building cleared out for the evening. "I'm not here to hurt you, Naomi," he said, stepping closer. "I'm here to give you a choice. If the elevator starts moving again, you can walk out and we can forget that report ever existed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glass vial. It was the one I had reported stolen yesterday. He held it between his thumb and forefinger like a piece of jewelry. "Or," he continued, "I can drop this. It's a very fragile container. If it breaks in this confined space, neither of us will make it to the lobby." I looked at the emergency hatch in the ceiling. It was too high. I looked at the doors. They were solid steel. I was trapped with a man who was willing to die just to keep a secret. The stranger I had been chatting with for half an hour was the person I had been trying to get arrested. He knew everything about me. He knew my commute, my name, and my fear of heights. Suddenly, the elevator hummed back to life. The red lights turned off, and the normal yellow light returned. We began to descend toward the lobby. Victor reached over and pressed the button for the garage level. He handed me the vial. His hand was steady. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who had just finished a business deal. "Make your choice, Naomi," he whispered as the bell chimed for the lobby. The doors opened. A group of people were waiting to get on. I looked at the crowd, then back at Victor. I stepped out of the elevator and watched the doors close on him. I went to my car and drove home in total silence. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell my boss. I just put the vial in my refrigerator. Every morning when I open the door for milk, I see it sitting there. It's been 3 months, and I still haven't decided if I'm keeping it to protect myself or because I've started to like the feeling of having the power to end everything. I live alone in a house that sits at the very end of a cul-de-sac. My backyard is mostly overgrown brush and a few tall oak trees that block the light even in the middle of the afternoon. It is a quiet place, or at least it was until 3 weeks ago. It started with the back gate. I always lock it with a heavy brass bolt, but every morning I would find it pushed open just a few inches. I told myself the wood was warping in the humidity. Then I found the bird feeder. It had been pulled down from the branch and placed neatly on the patio table. Not broken, not empty, just moved. I stood there for a full minute holding my coffee, looking at that feeder. It felt like a message I couldn't read. Night after night, the small things continued. I found a cigarette butt in the grass near the porch, though I have never smoked in my life. It was a brand I didn't recognize, unfiltered and crushed flat. I started double-checking the locks on my sliding glass doors twice every night. I felt a heavy weight in my chest whenever I had to go into the kitchen after dark. One Tuesday, I stayed up late to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever was happening. I turned off all the lights in the house and sat on the floor by the window. I stayed there for 3 hours, watching the shadows of the trees stretch across the lawn. The motion light finally kicked on at 2:14 in the morning. I didn't see a person at first. I just saw the light flood the yard, turning everything a harsh, artificial white. Then I saw a movement near the shed. A figure was standing there. It was a woman named Claire who used to work at the library where I spend my weekends. I hadn't spoken to her in months. She wasn't looking at the house. She was wearing a yellow raincoat that I recognized immediately. It was my raincoat, the one that had gone missing from my hall closet 2 weeks ago. I watched her through the glass. She wasn't trying to get in. She was pacing the perimeter of the fence, touching the wood with her fingertips like she was measuring something. She stopped at the center of the yard and pulled a small notebook from her pocket. She began to write frantically, looking up at my bedroom window every few seconds. I realized then that she wasn't hiding. She wanted me to see her. She wanted me to know she was there. I reached for my phone on the counter, my hand shaking so hard I almost dropped it. When I looked back out, she was gone. The yard was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the sofa with a kitchen knife in my lap until the sun came up. The next morning, I walked out into the yard to find the notebook she had been writing in. I found it tucked under the bird feeder. I opened the first page, expecting to see threats or rambling nonsense. Instead, the notebook was filled with a minute-by-minute log of my own life. It listed the time I brushed my teeth, the brand of cereal I ate, and the exact moment I turned off my bedside lamp. The log didn't stop at the previous night. I flipped to the very last page, and my heart stopped. The final entry was dated for today, but the time was listed as 10 p.m. tonight. It simply read, "He forgets to lock the basement window when the rain starts." I looked up at the sky. It was a clear, blue morning without a cloud in sight. But as I stood there, I felt the first cold drop of water hit my forehead. I walked to the basement window and looked down. The latch was sitting on the floor inside the house, cleanly unscrewed from the frame.